Now join me in welcoming Matthew White to the stage. Matt is a partner at PwC and heads up their cyber and digital trust business for the Middle East region, having been with the company for nearly 20 years. He's also an advisor to a number of startups that use AI to promote inclusivity in amateur sports. The topic he's going to present today is one that he's very passionate about. He will be talking about how important responsible AI is. Matt, over to you now.
Thank you for the introduction, Dia, and good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. I'll just share my screen. I read an interview today involving Professor Stuart Russell, who's the founder of the Center for Human Compatible Artificial Intelligence at Berkeley. He's also giving this year's Rife Lectures in the UK. He was asked his perspective on whether AI presents us with significant danger, even though that we probably haven't made as much progress as many people might think. And he gave two arguments as to why he thought the answer was yes. Firstly, even though our algorithms right now are nowhere close to general human capabilities, when you've got billions of them running at the same time, they can still have a very big impact on the world. And I think we've seen that quite recently. And secondly, he also believes it's entirely plausible that we will have a general purpose AI within our lifetimes or the lifetimes of our children. And if that's created in the context of the current superpower rivalry that we're experiencing, then the outcomes that we see could be the worst possible. And 2 months ago, a guy called Nicholas Chalin, who was the Pentagon's first chief software officer, very publicly resigned in protest at the slow pace of technological transformation in the US military. And specifically, he was quoted as saying, we have no competing fighting chance against China in 15 to 20 years. Right now, it's already a done deal. It's already over, in my opinion. And he also blamed the reluctance of Google to work with the US Defense Department on AI, and in particular, extensive debates over AI ethics for slowing the US down. And by contrast, he said that Chinese companies are obliged to work with Beijing and were making massive investment into AI without regard to ethics. Now, for the record, I'm not saying I agree with these statements. In fact, I think it's quite ironic that quite recently, probably in the last couple of weeks, China signed up to the UNESCO recommendation on AI ethics, but the US didn't. But I thought these two recent examples were about as good a place as any to start this short keynote, which is all about how important is responsible AI. And I wanted to start with a definition, my definition of what constitutes responsible AI. One of the problems I think we have is that we don't have a consistent accepted definition of what this constitutes across the world. And there are a number of dimensions to ensuring that AI is developed in a responsible manner. Some of these are very macro in nature, and by definition, they are top-down initiatives, and some of them are very technical in nature, and by definition, bottom-up initiatives. I'm not going to spend very long on these. I don't have very long for the keynote, but we have 5 of them. So ethics and regulation. This is largely government driven, but many organizations have also adopted their own ethics codes, and it's typically focused on large scale societal implications and prevention of malign consequences. This has become a very complicated space, in my opinion. It's not clear that everyone agrees. As I mentioned just now, the US and China didn't have the same views on the UNESCO AI ethics recommendations. But there's also another very important consideration where ethical decisions are concerned, which I thought was worth bringing to everybody's attention, namely what citizens deem as ethically acceptable differs quite considerably depending on where you're from. And it was actually Karen Howe of MIT Tech Review that wrote an article back on this in 2018 based on MIT's moral machine experiment. And this, I found this quite fascinating myself, essentially looking at decisions a self-driving car might make in an emergency situation. And many of you, including me at the time, might think that prioritizing saving a child over an elderly person was an obvious choice. But it seems not. There were quite significant differences in preferences by country, which correlated with culture. And in many cases, respondents valued saving the elderly over children, which makes this area pretty ambiguous, and therefore how you treat that as an organization can be very, very difficult. The other more top-down focused component is governance. Governance focuses on the risks and controls along an organization's AI journey, normally from top to bottom, and a governance framework defines how these risks are managed during the development cycles of AI, whether that's strategy or technical development or testing or whatever. And then we have three more technical bottom-up items: bias and fairness, interpretability and explainability, and robustness, security, safety, and privacy. Now, bias and fairness is concerned with the risk of making decisions that could lead to unfair outcomes for a particular individual or group. Interpretability and explainability is all about making sure humans can understand how a particular decision or a particular course of action is being arrived at by the AI. And robustness, security, safety, and privacy deals with performance, the risk of producing errors and making the wrong decisions, essentially. And it's pretty easy to see how these things can go wrong when you use these lenses. And given the kind of context of this conference, if we take a health lens, for example, and I won't go through all of these, but there quite recently has been evidence of racial bias in a pretty widely used algorithm, I think something like 200 million people in the US, which was used for determining the need for extra care. And this particular algorithm helps hospitals and insurance companies identify which patients will benefit from high-risk care management programs. But it relied on a faulty metric for determining need, and therefore significantly underestimated the need of Black patients by something in the region of 30%. And that translates to millions of people that potentially don't or didn't get the extra care that they needed at the time, or potentially in the future. There's been a lot of problems where people have tried to use algorithms to optimize COVID-19 vaccine distribution and logistics. Probably not surprising. I don't think we had very long to roll that stuff out. And it also seems that Google has been amassing health records from thousands of hospitals without notifying patients or doctors, although admittedly, I'm not entirely sure how. This includes stuff like lab results, doctor diagnoses, hospitalization records, and all sorts of other stuff, sort of amounting to a complete history of patient data, which is clearly a privacy issue. Now, look, these examples are not meant to suggest that companies don't care about responsible AI. We know that media coverage tends to spin these things in an unfavorable light. And in fact, there's a recent survey from the IDC that suggests 50% of companies have some sort of framework in place to encourage considerations and discussions around ethics, around bias, and around trust. The point I'm actually trying to get across is that this is a hard problem. It's multidisciplinary, it's ambiguous, it's costly, and it's time consuming. And therein, as the bard would tell us, lies the rub. I believe that one of the biggest challenges that we have is this race mentality. And I chose the quotes in the introduction carefully, but they are representative of what I think is a broader systemic problem when it comes to AI, which is that most players in this space want to be first. First to whatever, first to a new product, first to artificial general intelligence, whatever it might be. And there's a lot of reasons for this. Most traditional companies have some sort of financial incentive associated with creating AI products. That could be a share price relation. It could be that some startup organizations have investors they need to satisfy. It could be a market share play. Whatever it is, though, I think it's disingenuous to suggest that being first is not high up the list for many or most organizations that are experimenting with AI. And then you've got the nation state objectives, which could be benevolent, like healthcare systems or climate change solutions, or maybe not. Maybe they're more concerning, like warfare applications. But whichever way you look at it, it seems like we're in a race, and time is of the essence in a race. I think one famous tech executive used the term "done is better than perfect" in this context. So things that take significant thought or time tend to get deprioritized. And I'm not just hypothesizing here, but I've seen this happen in many situations where the economic pressures outweigh the need for things like risk management and control and governance. And the problem with that in the context of artificial intelligence is that the effects can be so pervasive that they end up being catastrophic. And I'm not talking about kind of Terminator catastrophic. I'm talking about something like the gradual amplification of existing social inequalities to the point where societies are on the brink of breaking down, and potentially there's conflict building. That could be just as damaging as an example, and could be triggered with the best of intentions. So in answer to the question posed for this keynote, how important is responsible AI? My answer is simple, very. And the sooner that organizations start collaborating instead of competing, the better, in my view. In the context of AI, done is not better than perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt. Wonderful. I think it's a very important topic to address, especially when you mentioned the different examples of AI going bad. And bias, privacy, and security are very important to consider while we see more use of AI tools and technologies in government and even across different sectors in the private sector. Thank you so much, Matt, for sharing your insights.
No problem.
And
I hope I kept to time, but I'm happy to
yeah,
answer
you did
later.
perfect. Thank you so much, and have a great long weekend.
Okay, you too. Thanks, everybody.